In August 1914, the Great War, a war unlike any previously experienced, erupted. Europe, and then large portions of the world, were pitched into armed conflict, which endured 5 long years. Canada was not immune. The war saw 619,636 Canadians enlist. Men and women from across the nation were affected. Who were these men and women who sacrificed so much? What were their experiences in the chaos of war?
I've always had this suspicion, especially with the way history gets taught, is we lose the individual story in those numbers. And even with the numbers that were originally pointed out to us, it's really hard to comprehend them on a personal level.
A team of 11 historians has written a book, Portraits of Battle, which explores the individual stories of some of the Canadian men and women whose lives were touched by the First World War.
We decided to look at individual soldiers and nurses, and to try and tell their particular stories. And we also wanted to bring in a third element, which was a discussion of some of the key issues about the Great War. So, was there a learning curve where the Canadians gradually got more adept at fighting this war? How did the soldiers at the front cope with what they were seeing? How were Indigenous soldiers treated? How did gender expectations evolve over the course of the wars?
Behind the battle, there were real people who fought, suffered, and died. The assault on Vimy Ridge is Canada's most famous Great War battle. Beginning at 5:30 a.m. on Easter morning, 1917, the Canadians launched their attack on German defenses. Between April 9th and 12th, the battle raged and many died. In fact, day 1 of the attack was the single bloodiest day of the war for Canadian forces in the entire conflict, with 2,398 killed. At the 100th anniversary celebration of the victory at Vimy in 2017, a moving ceremony was held that included the laying out, in neat ordered ranks, of empty combat boots to symbolize the dead. Major Samuel Bothwell of the 1st Canadian Mounted Rifles was killed on day 1. In many ways, the empty boots are an appropriate symbol for Bothwell. Little has been written about him.
One of the interesting things about Canada and the First World War is that there are certain images that are out there that most people subscribe to. And part of that is this idea of a kind of typical Canadian soldier. And, the kind of image that people have would be a young man, maybe 19, 20 years old, someone who enlisted enthusiastically rather than someone who was conscripted later in the war, and someone who returned home victorious. Particularly when we think of Vimy, we tend to focus on the achievement of Vimy rather than on the cost.
Bothwell was the antithesis of this image. Aged 36 at the time of the engagement, he had served with distinction in the Boer War, and he left behind 4 children in Mooside, Alberta, the town to which he had emigrated from his native Northern Ireland. At 6 foot 7 inches tall, he was far taller than the average member of the CEF, and perhaps this was a factor in his fate. He was wounded in the afternoon of day 1 and died of his wounds.
The situation in 1917 was not completely analogous to what it is today. Immigration was different. Overwhelmingly, the people who were coming to Canada from outside were from the British Isles. But Vimy is such a powerful icon in Canadian history and memory that it really is useful to leaders to kind of mobilize this battle in a particular way, because it's something that all Canadians feel good about. We were able to achieve something tremendous in taking the Ridge. And so if you can associate your party with a victory like this, it adds kind of a luster to your party, whether it's the Conservatives or the Liberals. In the immediate post-war years, when it was a matter of trying to determine which battles might be commemorated by the Canadian government, Vimy was one of many. And in fact, at one point, when they were trying to determine which site would be the home of the great monument that Allward had designed, there were actually some battles, other battles that were the front runners.
Many speak of the forging of a nation on the slopes of Vimy. Even here, Bothwell is not typical. If Canada was born on the ridge, as the Vimy myth tells us, his family did not get to enjoy its infancy. 3 years after the victory in 1917, Bothwell's wife remarried and resettled in the United Kingdom, leaving behind a single son in Canada. If Vimy represents Canada's iconic moment in the Great War, then Hill 70 represents a relatively obscure, though no less impressive, achievement. In an operation that lasted 10 days, beginning August 15, 1917, Canadian forces captured the high point in the area of the town of Lowe. General Arthur Currie's plan was a brilliant example of the bite and hold strategy, which captured smaller objectives, holding them, and allowing the enemy to wear themselves out through continuous counterattacks. Canadians have only recently become aware of the outstanding contribution of First Nations people to the Canadian war effort. Some still believe that First Nations were slow to embrace the war. In reality, the opposite was true. Many young Indigenous men enlisted in the early years of the war as a sign of solidarity with the British Crown. They followed the treaties they signed and saw themselves as allies of independent nations rather than subjects obligated to take up arms. Some also hoped that, in demonstrating their loyalty to Britain, they might be rewarded after the conflict with extended rights and benefits regarding control of their governance and financial affairs. Wilfrid Lickers enlisted in the largely Indigenous unit, the 114th Battalion of Brock's Rangers. He was later transferred to the 107th Timberwolf Battalion, which was redesignated as a Pioneer Battalion. These units were primarily tasked with constructing and breaching obstacles on the battlefield.
He was an average soldier from that area. He spent many times in the reserve units before the war, and when the war came, he was in a slightly turbulent position. He just had a child with an Indigenous woman from the neighboring reserve territory. And his father had just passed, and he literally at the same time was about to make the biggest change in his life and go overseas with his military unit, literally getting there just in time for the Battle of Hill 70.
After fighting in the Battle of Hill 70 and getting through the war, Lickers made his way home and immediately tried to reestablish his life. Upon returning home, Indigenous veterans would only be able to access their veterans' benefits from the Canadian government if they renounced their Indigenous status. With the passing of his wife before he had gone overseas, Lickers left his child with her family. Having no control over his life as a ward of the Crown, Lickers' bid to regain custody of his child was rejected by the Department of Indian Affairs, and she was placed in a residential school. Months later, she died, forcing Lickers to move on and start a new family.
The family shared with me a picture of Wilfrid Lickers post-war. I think he might be a grandfather at this point, or not. But it's him actually in his traditional Haudenosaunee dress, and he's smiling.
In the same way that the story of First Nations contributions to the war were, for many years, overlooked, so too was the work of women. Their important contributions have only recently been acknowledged in a fuller way. Women were very active on the home front, serving in munitions factories and providing labor on farms. They also formed patriotic leagues, drumming up financial support for the war effort and providing care packages for the men at the front. It is true that nursing had begun to gain acceptance in the mid-19th century. However, World War I saw a major opportunity for women to expand their role in war through becoming nursing sisters.
Canadian nurses were actually enlisted sister soldiers, as they were called, sort of colloquially, and got military rates of pay. They had officer status. Not only meant they were better paid than other nurses of other combatant countries at the time, they also were allowed to fraternize with male officers, which was a bit of a treat, apparently. You know, it meant you could dance with the upper crust of the military at social events and that sort of thing, whereas other nurses didn't have that privilege, which kind of irked them, I think, in some cases. So there was actually quite a lot of jostling to try to get in to the Canadian nursing corps during the First World War. It was a good place to be professionally and socially and you know, financially.
Nursing sisters Catherine Mcdonald, Gladys Wake, and Margaret Lowe gained notoriety when they were killed following a German bombing raid on a military hospital complex at Etap on May 19, 1918. Winnipegger Margaret Lowe was only 30 years old, and Gladys Wake, from Esquimalt, British Columbia, was only 34 years old at the time of their deaths. At age 24, Catherine Mcdonald, from Brantford, Ontario, was the youngest of the three. The personal and corporate grief occasioned by their death was intense and felt by their families, their communities, and throughout Canada. Grief was everywhere during the war. Cynthia Camacchio examined the lives of twins Arnold and Clarence Westcott. Arnold, known as the caregiver of the family, enlisted first in the 161st Battalion, with his more adventurous brother Clarence enlisting soon after. Arnold would survive the war, but his brother Clarence was killed in action. With the help of records passed down to Arnold's son, Dr. Camacchio was able to paint a moving portrait of a man who came through the war, but never fully escaped its haunting presence.
He never talked about what that meant to him, what the loss meant to him. He did suffer all his life from head pain due to that shrapnel that remained lodged in his head. They could not remove it without causing further damage. He also had periodic depressive episodes. Again, we would call it post-traumatic stress syndrome, but in those days it wasn't talked about. If they called it shell shock, that was just something that most veterans buried. They didn't discuss it out loud. It was still considered shameful, and you know, had a sense of what they call malingering, that they were making it up just to, you know, get extra benefits or not to have to fight when they were out at the front and so on.
After the war, Arnold returned home to Canada to start a family. According to Arnold's son, who was named after Clarence, the loss of his twin brother was never far from his mind. The grieving process was complicated by the expectation that men would remain stoic in the face of suffering. This made it all the more difficult for Arnold to deal with the loss of his twin.
So he never spoke, the father, Arnold, never spoke of having had shell shock, but he said he remembers young Claire, the namesake, the son of Arnold and the nephew of Clarence, remembers from the youngest age how important the actual public commemoration, how Remembrance Day was so important to his dad when the veterans of the 161st Battalion and others would gather at the Seaforth Memorial, because like every small town, they had a memorial erected very quickly to the soldiers of the Great War, and how sad and stricken he looked, and how occasionally he would actually see a tear rolling down his cheek.
The public memory of the Great War still tends to overlook the immense mental and emotional toll on all those veterans who returned home, whole in body, but suffering invisible wounds like those carried by Arnold Westcott. It is impossible to claim that any individual or small group of individuals is representative of the Canadian experience in the First World War, but the chapters in Portraits of Battle answer a great deal of questions while also challenging our simple understanding of the Great War. The 11 authors who contributed to Portraits of Battle cast their nets wide to understand the range of experiences of individuals whose lives were touched by the conflict. This anthology provides a unique approach to the history of the Great War, combining biography, eyewitness account, filling in many gaps that persist in our understanding of this significant moment in Canadian history.